Okay. All right. Well, the number keeps rising. So I'm glad that everybody's here tonight to talk about how to avoid plagiarism and exam violations when completing the Create Performance task. We're here to help you tonight to get you through this piece of your exam that's 30% of your exam. So it's really important that all the hard work and efforts that you put in, that you're able to do that and get it scored without running into an exam violation or plagiarism. So my name is Crystal Furman, and I am the director for AP Computer Science Principals here at the College Board. I work with the curriculum, the assessment, and the instruction. Joining me tonight is my colleague, Maureen Reyes. Maureen, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Maureen Reyes here. I'll be helping Crystal to monitor the chat, helping answer your questions, and helping to manage this webinar.
Yeah, so you can type questions in the Q&A for Maureen, and she'll either answer them directly or we will pause throughout and I will answer your questions tonight. Okay, so we are going to go through and kind of just address what is plagiarism. I'm going to demonstrate for you several types of plagiarism that we see every year, some common mistakes that students make. We are going to walk you through navigating the plagiarism appeal process and some additional strategies for avoiding plagiarism. And then again, we'll have ample time at the end for questions. So why are we talking about plagiarism? There really isn't a huge percentage of students that get caught in plagiarism, but what we are finding is that those students who do get caught in plagiarism, they're not necessarily doing it intentionally. They're not out to cheat. It's more a misunderstanding about what constitutes plagiarism. And so we want to help you to understand how to cite things properly and the techniques and strategies that you need to understand to avoid being caught in plagiarism. So that's the goal for tonight. So this discussion is really meant to help you. These rules and guidelines that we're following kind of transfer not just for computer science principals, but for other classes as well throughout your high school career and into college, if you go that route, or even into career. So most likely this isn't the last time you'll have to do a project or write a paper. And so a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight and a lot of the plagiarism examples you could apply to other papers and other projects that you do either for school or when you enter the workforce, because plagiarism here is going to have a penalty in terms of your Create Performance task grade, but that's going to be small compared to some of the negative consequences you can suffer if you continue to plagiarize when you go into other classes and into college and into career. So we want to make sure everybody's informed, that you understand what it is and how to avoid it. So in 2022, 2% of students were flagged for suspected plagiarism. 132,000 students completed the Create PT honestly and did not get suspected of plagiarism. So that's really something great to celebrate. The majority of students completed the Create PT without suspicion of plagiarism. So this, like I said, is a small percentage of students who maybe misunderstood what they could or couldn't do. And so we want you to be in this 98% or even higher percentage of students who do not get suspected of plagiarism this year in 2023. So what is plagiarism? So in our course and exam description and in the student handout on page 11, you'll see our policy on plagiarism. And it addresses the use of media, data, information, evidence, program code written by someone else, anything that you use in your program or in your written response without acknowledgement is considered plagiarism. And what we're looking for in the written response, because that's the part that we grade, is your student voice. It should be clearly evident, and the ideas of others should be acknowledged, attributed, or cited. And when we talk about attribution and citation, we're really referring to the program, because the written response should be your demonstration of your understanding of your program. So there really isn't any citation or attribution that should be happening in the written response. All of that should happen in the program itself. So making sure your student voice is present. And I'm going to say that probably another several times tonight, that you need to make sure your own individual voice is coming through. You'll also see on page 14, these are the things you may not do. And the second one is to submit practice performance tasks or any work that has been revised, amended, corrected by another individual other than your collaborative partner. So anything that you would get feedback from your teacher on, none of that that's been practiced is allowed to be submitted for your final score. If you submit a program that has been used as an example or was discussed in class, you must submit original responses to avoid plagiarism. You cannot submit the same project or something from a provider's example project or one of the samples that are online for your performance test. When you submit your work, for the create performance task in the digital portfolio, you will attest to your work being your work and the originality of it. So the first one says, I affirm that the work I submitted is my own and that I have read and understood the AP Computer Science Principles policies on plagiarism. So for each piece, each component, the written response, the video, and the program code, you have to do these attestations. You have to click all three of these buttons. So there are three components. All three of them have a final submit process because we want to make sure that you are affirming this for all three of these components as you're submitting for the create performance test. So make sure that you're looking at these documents and know what you're attesting to when you do your affirmations. Okay, so some takeaways before we really dive in here a little bit more. Before you start, make sure you understand the task. Your teacher is going to provide you with 12 classroom hours minimum to complete this create performance task, but your teacher is not going to be able to help you with it. So all of the preparation and all of the understanding about what you're supposed to do, how it's going to be scored, all of that needs to be done up front. So before you start, make sure you understand all of it, the task directions, the guidelines, and the scoring notes. Ask your teacher if you have any questions or you need clarifications. Understand what you need to do because that will give you the confidence to complete it without help. I think sometimes students get nervous. This is a test, right? So they get a little nervous, and that's when the urge to maybe, oh, can I look at your responses to make sure that I'm on the right track comes into play, and then that's when we start to get into trouble. Do not collaborate on your responses. Collaboration is allowed as long as it's another CSP peer on the writing of the program only. You are not allowed to collaborate on the video or the written responses. So if you wrote your written responses and your collaborative peer says, hey, can I look at your written responses because I want to just see if I'm on the right track, you shouldn't share it because that would be collaborating on the written responses. Be sure not to share any documents that contain your written response with your collaborative peer. I know a lot of you are trying to be helpful, help each other out. You wrote this program together and you worked so collaboratively, and then you have to stop collaborating and you have to do your own work. And that's hard to do, but it's really for your own protection and for the protection of your collaborative partner for you each to be able to go off on your own and write your written responses. That's really key for you to be able to avoid plagiarism. And number 3, where's your voice? Student voice needs to be evident in the written response. The best way to do this is to write your responses independently of all reference materials. So keep those notes closed, keep the samples closed while you're writing the response so that you avoid mirroring them too closely. Then if you want to open up the rubric and see, did you miss something in the rubric? That would be great. Open up the rubric though. Don't look at samples and try to make yours match the sample because that's plagiarism. Okay, so here I'm going to show you some examples of what we've seen this year and in the past year so you can avoid it. This is a really busy graphic here, and it is somebody that puts together these infographics. I cited my source at the bottom of the page there, and so you can, it's the visualcommunicationguy.com, so you can see that I cited my source. These first 5 types of plagiarism on the left of this spectrum are the ones that we see and the ones that we'll talk about tonight. They are on the more severe side. So this scale is severe on the left to not as severe on the right? So we're talking about the most severe forms of plagiarism that exist, and those are the types that we're seeing in that 2% that get flagged. So what are they? Identity theft. So you want to ask yourself, did you steal, copy, or purchase another entire document and take full credit for it as being your own? That is what we call identity theft. Maybe you didn't purchase it, but maybe you took your collaborative partners and submitted it. You don't want to do that. Copycat. Did you copy large portions, entire paragraphs and sections of another's work and not give full credit? So sometimes what we see is two partners work together and maybe all but one answer was done independently, but then for one answer, for whatever reason, one partner copied the other. That's plagiarism, and those get flagged for plagiarism and could wind up having a 0 for the create performance task for the whole thing. So it doesn't have to be the whole paper. It could just be one answer, and that would cause you to be flagged for plagiarism. Cherry picking. I have often referred to this as playing Mad Libs with the responses. So did you cherry pick a few terms and phrases to change, but keep the rest of the text and ideas from another's work relatively unchanged without giving credit? So we see this with some of the samples that we've put out online. We see this with samples that our endorsed provider curriculums have out there, where students take that and they just cherry pick out the things that need to change to suit their program, but it looks like they've played Mad Libs, like a fill in the blank. That's an extreme form of plagiarism. The last two, mitosis and recycling, really come from you using a previously written performance task. So mitosis, did you duplicate an entire work of your own? You actually can't copy from yourself, which is why we say you can't submit anything from practice. You have to do things from scratch. This is reported by teachers if you reuse practice performance tasks. Recycle is the same thing. If you have large portions of your work that you've repurposed for this. So again, the practice create performance tasks. So let's make sure we don't do that. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of the first three, several examples of the first three. So here's the first one. So if you look at the top portion where it says author, that's the person that wrote this paragraph. So maybe this is just one part of the create performance task, one answer there. And so they wrote what the video is showing. So that's in the author section. And then their collaborative partner, if you look, that is identical. That's the exact same answer there. So there is no difference between the author and the peer submission. I think everyone would agree. This is definitely plagiarism here, right? You can't submit the same thing. Even if it's just for one part of the create performance task, this is plagiarism. So how does this happen? How could this happen? We see that collaborative peers maybe didn't realize that they weren't supposed to write the written responses together. And so they sat down and wrote this together. You cannot collaborate on the written response. The other thing we see is that one student writes it and then they share it with another student. And we hear it all the time. Well, my collaborative partner wanted to see what I wrote, so I shared it with them. Well, then they end up writing what you wrote and you both get flagged for plagiarism. And then the other thing that happens, and this is really unfortunate, is sometimes work gets saved on the same computer and one student accidentally opens the wrong file and submits another student's written response. It's still plagiarism. Both students get caught in the plagiarism, and then we have to untangle that. And one student's going to get a 0, the person that accidentally submitted it. So each of these three scenarios, both students are flagged for plagiarism, and then there's a process that has to be followed. Okay, this one is a little different. So everything that's in this magenta pink here is different between the author and the collaborative partner. But I think if you look closely, what is the difference? So the first one, the author says the, and the collaborative peer says my, okay? The next thing that's the same is generation. Notice there's a typo in the collaborative peer. They also misspelled poem. And then you'll see some punctuation differences. So pine, star, lies, they have commas between them and a period after, etc. in the author, and the collaborative peer took those out. You'll see the next thing, it says it in one and then this in the other. And then multiple is in the author, but the collaborative peer left that out. They also left out the things that were in parentheses, and then they changed generated to created. So there really is very little difference here. Mostly it's spelling things or things that are being omitted. These small changes it's still plagiarism. Even with these differences, this is still considered plagiarism and considered identity theft or copycat. Here's another one. So this one, somebody took a lot of effort to try to make their work not look like they're the original author. They went through and they changed video to recording. They changed shows to displays. They changed generation to creation, poem to ballad. I think this person probably spent more time using a thesaurus to try to generate words to match the author than they would have spent if they had just sat down, closed their notes, and just wrote the answers themselves. This is going to get caught for plagiarism, and these students are going to get their scores held, and one or both of them are going to get a 0 on the create performance task. So we've seen this. These are examples of things we've actually seen, and we do catch these. So here is what cherry picking looks like in code. So we also see it happening in code. So on the left is the College Board sample D, and on the right is the student response. And what you see as the difference is, like in the left, the variable names change. So this is puck X, and this one's coordinate Y. So they changed the order, right? The next one is puck Y and then coordinate X. So they changed the order of things. One's going left to right, one's going top to bottom, but it's basically the same. And they changed the numbers a little bit. The algorithm is the same there. Then for the next thing, they say score at 0 plus plus. Well, that's the same as points at 0 equals points at 0 plus 1. It's the same thing. It means the same thing. And then left to bottom. This, I could continue, but these two algorithms are essentially the same thing, and they just tried to make them look a little different by changing just a few things about the code. So when you're extending an existing program from practice or samples, you need to add new functionality. You cannot just change the names of variables or modify output lines slightly, change like the literal values in the assignment statements, conditionals, loops, etc. And then the other thing we see a lot is people just try to change the data source. So you have a program that's supposed to be manipulating data, and they're just changing the data source, but the algorithm is still a filter algorithm, for example. That's still going to be the same as the sample that you were given. And so you really cannot use that. You need to do something additional, add another procedure. So you filter the data, great. Now what are you going to do? What's the next thing you're going to do? What's the next procedure you're going to add? And then that is what you should be writing about. Here's an example of cherry picking in the written response. So in this case, the programs are actually different. One is about a game, players in a game. And the other one's about a grade book, but you look at the lines that are in yellow and they are exactly the same. So this is where I say they played Mad Libs, and they took the specifics out that were related to the specific program and they replaced it with specifics about their own. So instead of previous players of the game, it's a grade book. Instead of high scores, it's grades. But the bulk of this response is an exact match. This is cherry picking, and it's not allowed, and it's considered plagiarism. Here's another one that is still cherry picking. So we've got everything that was in blue from before, right? But then they tried to make it even less like the original, right? So instead of represents, they said it is representative of the. Well, that's synonyms there. Instead of the scanner class, they say input. Instead of using, they say the use of. Instead of document, they say file. So they're really trying to make it look different, but it's not different. They're just changing a few things to make it look good. It's still based on this example here. And then in green is where they paraphrase things. The saved data is processed for displaying the high score. And then they just paraphrased it as, and then displayed. The other thing that this student did was they tried to change a few things around from like this to my to make it look good. They added code in there so that, they're just trying to add some extra words, and they added an extra sentence. But the bulk of this answer is still the sample answer. So doing these little changes here does not make it not plagiarism. It just means you worked harder to plagiarize. So this is still plagiarism. Again, it's easier probably to just set that example aside and write your own work so that it's in your own words than it is to try to play this game and then you get caught for plagiarism. Okay, so some strategies to avoid plagiarism. Why don't I pause before I get into this, Maureen? Does anyone have questions on these examples? Do I need to look at something additional?
There are a lot of questions. So why don't we go through a few first? Everybody's asking about this recording. So this copy of this recording of this webinar will be emailed to everybody after this. So you will get a copy of the recording. So let's see. There are a lot of questions about when working with partners. So there's questions about, you know, are we only allowed to work on the code together? What are the sort of parameters for working with a partner and ensuring that you're not both getting cited for plagiarism? So can you just give a quick overview of that and best practices?
So you are only allowed to work on the program code together with your partner. And then when it comes time to do the video and the written responses, you need to not collaborate at that point. And some of the other things we'll address in this strategies to avoid plagiarism section, like, how can you avoid including the same list or the same procedure in your written response and how to deal with that kind of thing.
And then along with that, about citing their partner's code and their code and how to cite code in where do they need to cite that, et cetera. So can you just give a quick overview of that?
Sure. So when you're citing program code, if you're writing something truly collaborative and you both have input into certain pieces of the program, you don't have to worry about citing. So if you're doing something in a paired programming situation where you and your partner are writing things together, and you're writing it from scratch, then there is no citation needed in your program. If you and your partner decide that you are going to write one piece and your partner is going to write another piece and you're going to bring those two pieces together and you're truly doing it separately, then you probably do need to cite. Not probably, then you need to cite your partner and you can just say, my partner wrote this part, my partner wrote that part. I don't recommend that as much because then what are you going to do if you wrote the part that dealt with the list and your partner wrote the part that dealt with the procedure? You can't use something that you didn't write in the written response. So you both should be really actively involved. And even if that means that they kind of did the design, but then you gave feedback on that and wrote that piece together, that's great. What really needs to be cited for program code is if you started with a starter code, like maybe your teacher was big into doing things with graphics, and so there was a graphics class with a bunch of libraries that you're going to use to aid the development of your program. You would cite those libraries, cite those that's any starter code that was given by the teacher. The way that you would do that is you would put in comments, this was developed by my teacher, or this was, I found this code online, or whatever. You cannot use anything that wasn't written by you in your written response. So when you grab code from online or you grab code from your teacher, make sure you're extending it by adding a new list so that you can meet your list component, and adding new functionality by writing a new procedure that includes the sequencing and selection and iteration that you need. Most programming languages allow you to write comments. So you can do a comment in there. If you are using a programming language that doesn't have a comments functionality, you can print your code into a Word document or into a PDF, and you can add your own comments in there to do that.
Great. And so just to underscore that, because there are a lot of questions, what if somebody gets help from a video and they get code from that video? They would just need to cite the video. If they're using open source code, they would just need to cite the open source code, right? So the bottom line, Crystal, is if they're pulling code from anywhere, video, open source, wherever, they need to cite it. But then for their written responses, they need to add to what you just said, new functionality and their own list. What about, you mentioned citing, I think you mentioned citing lists, but what about data sets? So for example, if they're pulling a data set from somewhere, do they have to cite that?
Yeah, they should cite where they pulled their data set from. If it's not one that they've constructed themselves, they should just cite, and the URL for where you found the data set is perfectly acceptable. And that's fine. And it's fine to use that data set because you're probably pulling that data set and you're reading that in from a file into your program. So the code you're using to pull that data in is your program code, right? And you're just going to say, I'm pulling from a particular data set that I found in this location.
And I think there was a little bit of confusion because you mentioned if students were working on a project before the create task started, but then took that project and continued to work on it. How do they need to acknowledge at all that, one portion was developed prior to, and now that they're extending this, do they need to comment about that at all? Yeah.
Get into that is if they don't, then their teachers will know, right? They'll know that project was turned in prior. Probably want to make notes so that when your teacher looks at it, they realize where they've given feedback and where the new stuff starts. Yes, you should definitely do that so that you're covering your bases. All right, should we get into the strategies to avoid
let's
plagiarism?
move on.
Okay, great. So some strategies that you can use to avoid plagiarism. Number one, be sure, this is what we've just been talking about, be sure to extend any existing programming code by adding new functionality. Use this new functionality for your written responses. If you use something that you've already written and gotten feedback on, you're violating our guidelines, and that is a form of plagiarism. When possible, use a different procedure and list than your collaborative partner. Now, that might not always be possible because you might only have one list or one procedure in there that meets the requirements. But if it's possible for you all to use different ones, then that it helps to ensure that you're writing about different things, meaning that you're going to be less likely to say the same things in your written responses. If you can't do that, it's not a problem. Just make sure that you're not sharing your work with your partner, and the likelihood of you saying the exact same words in the same order is relatively slim. Avoid using generic language especially to describe how lists manage complexity. So a lot of kids use a lot of buzzwords in there, and the problem is they're not going to get credit anyway. Credit isn't awarded if they don't connect their answer to their program code. So avoid those buzzwords and be specific about how your program could be written or could not be written or could be written differently without that list. So here's an example. We have this explain how the selected list manages complexity in your program code by explaining why your program code could not be written or how it would be written differently if you didn't use a list. Notice it keeps saying your program code, your program code. You need to connect this back to your specific program. So here's an example response. The lists are extremely helpful when wanting to store a large amount of values/data. Having the ability to use lists prevents one from having to create a bunch of different variables that would all have different names and only store a single piece of data or a single value. Using a bunch of individual variables instead of a list makes your code unorganized, lengthy, and prone to mistakes. A user could possibly reuse the same variable name and delete one of their values altogether. Overall, lists allow the condensed and more organized coding. That all sounds great, but does anyone know what that program is about? Or what the list in that program is actually doing, what it's managing complexity? I have no idea what this program is about at all. And this program was written 2 years ago, so now I really don't have any idea as to what it was about. It's a great description as to how lists in general manage complexity, but it's not tied to the program. And so this answer did not receive credit at all. So you want to avoid these buzzwords, avoid this jargon, and really get into how is your list managing complexity in your program. The more specific you can be, the more you're connecting it to your program code, the less likely that it's going to sound like everybody else's answer. Number 4, do not use provided sentence starters or templates. If your teachers give you a template, do not use it. I'm going to say it again. If your teachers give you a template with sentence starters, Do not use that template because you will get flagged for plagiarism, because everyone in your class will match to those sentence starters and you will get flagged for plagiarism. Do not use any templates or sentence starters provided by your teachers. Put all that stuff away, start fresh. You're smart. You've learned so much in computer science principles. You know how to do this. You know what the answers need to look like. You do your own work and you're going to do fantastic. Number 5, use different sample testing data than your collaborative partner. So in 3D, it talks about passing different values. You may want to make sure that you don't pass the same values or describe the same values as your collaborative partner. I wouldn't say that that's collaborating. That's just saying, hey, what values did you use so I don't use the same ones? Use different values. If you're not collaborating, what are the odds that you're going to actually choose the same values anyway? Probably very low. Number 6, you should type your answers directly into the digital portfolio. This account isn't shared with anyone else. And I think that the place where students get the most, they get compromised the most is when they use like a Google Docs or a Word document or something like that, where they can share it with other people, or they can have somebody make a copy of it after they're done. Then somebody's got your work and they're going to plagiarize it. If your friend says, oh no, I just want to look at your answers to make sure my answers are on track, they do not. They are going to take your answers. They're going to use it as a template, and your answers now are going to look like their answers. And you're both going to get stuck in plagiarism. So type your stuff in the digital portfolio because there's no sharing out of that, and type it directly in there so that you've got a revision history and everything is in there. Google Docs is fine, but you want to make sure you're not sharing a copy. We did have a student who left the room to use the bathroom, and somebody sitting next to them looked on their screen and copied their work off the screen. You have to be very protected and guarded about your work. This is a test. So just like you would cover your answers when you're taking a multiple choice test so your neighbors can't see, you need to take precautions to ensure that the work that you're doing stays private and secure to you. Do not use citations in the written response because this should be your own words. Citations in the program code can be included in comments or other documentation. Program code not written by you or your collaborative partner should not be used in the written response. Make sure you're using code that you all wrote in the written response. Number 8, anytime you are incorporating the ideas of others, this goes for computer science principles, this goes for anything you do from today forward into college, into your career. Any time you incorporate the ideas of others, even if you're paraphrasing it, you need to give credit to the author of these ideas. Plagiarism detected in a single response may still result in your written response being flagged for plagiarism. And if you're caught for plagiarism, it's 30% of your grade. It's not, oh, I only plagiarized 3C. Can you grade the other pieces? The answer is no. If you're caught for any single response, the whole thing gets caught for plagiarism, and that's 30% of your grade. So 4 really big key takeaways here. Number 1, write your responses independently. Put all your notes away. Be confident that you can answer the questions on your own and in your own words. Number 2, do not use public samples or templates to craft your written responses. Number 3, do not share your work. Keep your work private. This is a test. Don't share your responses with your partner to give them ideas. You're both really smart. You'll both be fine if you do your own work. By doing so, you open both of yourselves up to plagiarism. Number 4, do not reuse your work. It is best to start your project from scratch. Extending an existing program means that you have to create all new functionality and add a new list, which I think is probably the harder part, so that you have new program code to write about. You are not allowed to submit work that has been done in practice. All right, so we're going to get into what's the process if you end up being in that 2%, very small number of kids that gets caught for plagiarism. What is going to be your process? So what happens if plagiarism is suspected. So we use automated and manual processes to identify student plagiarism. We also allow teachers to report plagiarism. So every year, teachers report plagiarism to us. If you're identified, or if someone is identified, their score is placed on hold, meaning when everybody else gets a score for their AP exams, you won't have one. So it's placed on hold pending further investigation and potential for you as a student to appeal that plagiarism accusation. A letter will be sent to you as the student explaining your options. This will come in an email. So it's really important, if you have your College Board account linked to your school email, and you won't have access to your school email over the summer, you might want to rethink what email account you use for your College Board account. I would recommend using your personal email with your College Board account. So every year we have students who, don't have access to their email in the summer, or they're seniors and they graduate and now they don't have access to their school email. Your College Board account should really be linked to a personal email account so that you continuously have access to your files, your work, your scores, your grades that are associated with AP and SAT. So this letter that you're going to get an email, not you all, because you all are not going to get caught for plagiarism because you attended this session. But if your friend does, who didn't attend this session and doesn't know about plagiarism like you do now, they are going to have some options. They can cancel their score. They can take a 0 on the create performance task. And remember, this is 30% of the score, or they can appeal and present evidence. So if they choose to appeal, they must prove to me that they are the author. This generally requires some investigation on the part of the school or a confession by their peer who plagiarized the student work. So as I said, student went to the bathroom, somebody looked at their stuff, the school had to do an investigation. The student who looked at the screen while the other student was in the bathroom confessed that. And so the student who went to the bathroom got their grade. The other student didn't. Collaborative peers, one provided the other with theirs just to look at because they needed ideas. Student confessed, I didn't just look at it, I copied what you had. That student would get the 0 and the other student would be cleared to move on. But that takes investigation on the part of the school or onus on you. So best to avoid it to begin with. Students who match to public samples are not granted appeals at all. So if there's a public sample out there, which we have several at the College Board, and there are several out there by endorsed providers, if you match to a public sample, you are not granted an appeal. You're actually not even granted the option to appeal. That's an automatic plagiarism. And you can either cancel your score or take a 0 on the create performance task. Those are your options. You can present revision history. Sometimes it's helpful, but it doesn't always prove originality. So because it's really easy for someone to just take a copy of somebody else's work or retype, share a screen side by side and retype the work of someone else. So revision history, while it sometimes can be helpful and it gives us insight, it does not approve originality on our side. The option C is a teacher attestation, but teacher attestations without investigation will also not approve originality. So teachers will need to do some examining of student work compared to other students in the class and then confront the students. Teachers may need to enlist the help of their administration. Last year, there was a teacher who had, 2 kids. They were like, oh, I think these kids, I didn't get a score for them. They inquired. I said, well, unfortunately, those students are being held for plagiarism. The teacher looked into it. They were able to compare the students' work side by side. They were able to then do their own investigation, determine which student was the one that was the originator and which student plagiarized. And they were able to write a letter saying, in this case, student A is the originator, student B is the student that plagiarized. And then we were able to give a score to student A as they were determined as to be not at fault. And student B, they didn't get a score. So it's not enough for a teacher to say, I really like Maureen. She's fantastic. I hold her credibility in high regard. I can't believe she would ever cheat or do any plagiarism. That's wonderful that the teacher has such a great opinion of Maureen, but that doesn't prove that Maureen didn't make a mistake. What did we say at the beginning? We said we don't actually really feel like students do this maliciously a lot of the time. A lot of times it's done because they're doing it not knowing that what they're doing is actually plagiarism. So hopefully this session helps you to understand the different things that are actually plagiarism that you may have done and didn't realize were plagiarism. So your teacher saying great things about you, I believe all those great things that teachers say about kids. I was a teacher, and I believe all kids are fantastic and trying their very best. And all kids make mistakes. And sometimes kids do this without knowing what they're doing is actually plagiarism. So that brings me to the end of my portion. And the rest of the time is for us to take any questions. So
Great, Crystal. Thanks so much. So there are questions from teachers because this webinar is both for teachers and students. So
yep.
I took a lot of the student questions earlier. I'm going to give you some of the teacher questions now, and then also pivot to some of the direct student questions also.
Sure.
Can you talk about what happens when students get plagiarized or flagged for plagiarism for the teachers? Do the teachers find out what happens? And is, when the teacher reports the students for plagiarism, is that anonymous or is that reported as well?
All right, so those are two different cases. So when a teacher reports plagiarism to the student, reports a student of plagiarism, those are reviewed. Sometimes teachers are just maybe unclear. They're trying to make sure that they're following the guidelines. And so sometimes teachers report plagiarism that I look at and I say, you know what, that's not actually plagiarism. It's okay. And that we push it through. So if you're ever unsure, don't be afraid to report it because it is looked at before it is actually something that's sent to the student. I believe in the option letter now we do say how they were identified for plagiarism, whether it be that it was reported by a teacher, or so we're trying to give students a little bit more information about what type of plagiarism they have there. So I do believe I would have to look at the option letters to see exactly, but I do believe that that is one of the changes that we made. In terms of, do teachers find out? That's something that we're working on in terms of updating our processes. Currently, teachers are not notified about student plagiarism. The students are actually our customer. They're the ones that are taking the exam. And so we do not share those plagiarism flags with the school or with the teacher. So the way that teachers have in the past found out is because their student will come and say, hey, I got this letter. Can you help me? It says I need a teacher attestation. So that's how teachers often find out. Now we're considering how can we also notify the teacher, especially if they have several kids in their classroom who are flagged for plagiarism. So constantly trying to take the feedback from teachers and do revisions to make sure that this process is really fair and as helpful to both students and teachers as possible. I think the big takeaway here is that the punitive part for students is that 30% of their Create PT. If a school decides to do additional consequences, that would only happen if they were to find out through either the student or through an inquiry, because they can inquire of us and we can tell them also. So that the punitive part from our standpoint is in the Create performance task there. Hopefully I answered that question. Would you add anything to that, Maureen?
No, I think that's great.
Okay.
So there are a few questions from teachers about how they can help students when, one question was around, sometimes there are just simple algorithms that can't be modified. So how would you advise students with that? Or, sometimes when teachers are using curriculum from certain providers, their data sets are very similar and sometimes get flagged for plagiarism. So I guess, giving some tips to teachers about how to navigate some of these situations with their students.
Yeah, unfortunately, changing the data set does not change change things significantly enough for students to not get caught in plagiarism. So what they have to do is, so now you've filtered it, because that's the one that's most popular. You've filtered the data for a certain thing. Students should add another functionality to that. They should extend it. They have 12 classroom hours to complete this project. So just changing out the data set for a new data set and filtering it slightly differently, I don't think that that constitutes 12 hours of programming. I think that's probably maybe a class period, maybe a half class period for the kids to do that. So what they need to do is they need to add new functionality, and that new functionality should be in the form of a procedure that has sequencing, selection, and iteration. If they can't do that, then maybe they have to come up with something totally different from what that provider is giving. So maybe they come up with a new idea. One of the things that we've really encouraged, and this came from the development committee, and this is really their vision, this would also help with row one, what's the purpose of my program, is for kids to kind of sit back and think, okay, why do I want to develop this program? What is the reason behind this program that I want to develop? Think about the problem they're trying to solve, or the question that they're trying to investigate. Think about that first, and then write a program that solves that. By doing that, they would have the purpose defined first, like this is what I'm trying to solve with it, or this is the question I'm trying to answer with it, or this is the creative expression that I'm trying to go for. And then they can write their program from there. So I would say they really need to dig a little deeper, and remember that this is their final project. So dig a little deeper. Don't just mirror what you were doing in class. Come up with something new for yourself based on an interest of yours. That'll make it more engaging for students and less likely for them to fall into a plagiarism trap.
Great. One more question from a teacher. Sometimes in the teacher trainings, whether it be, the institute, APS summer institutes or provider trainings, they're given, guidance on, how to best answer, questions to the written responses and how to guide students. And so how, can you share some tips on how to guide students in answering those questions, but not, provide them the answers or sort of given them sort of standard template language that they're using? So what are sort of some guardrails around guiding students in answering the questions?
Yeah, I think this is great, because I think we need to have a little bit more faith in students. They can do this task. And we have a series of 12 formative assessment questions in the AP question bank that scaffold their written responses to the actual written response. And what I would have you do, or what I would have my students do, is I would pair programs from the very beginning with some of those written responses, and I would not give them templates. I would have them answer it, and I would give them feedback about their response. Match it up with the rubric, highlight for them, you need to say more about this part. You didn't fully answer this piece of it. That's what I would do. I would not show them a full example until maybe right before a full example, matching it up with the scoring guidelines so that they understand the scoring guidelines. But really scaffold that writing so that they're super comfortable writing it in their own words. And I would not ever give my kids a template, because this is an exam. It's a college level assessment, and they can do this. They can answer those questions. So I can't really speak to what you're being told in training, but we have resources that can really help you guide students, and the guidance is going to come in your feedback to them. Let them write first, and then give them feedback on how to make their writing better, and not by giving them certain keywords to say, but by saying, look at this piece of the rubric here. Have you answered this part of it that they're asking you? And give them another chance until they can craft it themselves.
Great, Crystal. So switching back to some of the student questions, there's still a lot of questions around working with a partner. How many partners can they work with? What if they're working on their own, but they want a fellow student to just help debug? Can they, if they're an independent student, can they just work with their teacher on their program? So there's just a lot of questions around who they can work with, how many people they can work with. Can they do this on their own? Can they do this individually? So provide some answers there.
Yeah, these are great questions. Okay, who can you collaborate with? A collaborative peer is defined as another CSP student. Can you work with your teacher? No, they are not another CSP student. Can you work with your dad, your mom, your older brother, your aunt, your uncle, your older sister, your little sister? No, you can only work with another computer science principles student, current computer science principal student on the Create Performance task. How many people? We get that question a lot. You have to be actively engaged in the development of the program in order to write the written responses. You really, truly have to be in it and actively engaged. So I guess my answer to that is, how big is your program? Is your program large enough to support a larger group of kids working together and collaborating where each person is actively engaged? Or are 2 people doing the work and 3 others sitting back going for a ride? If it's the latter, then your group is too large. Every person should be actively engaged in developing the program. If you're talking about something on the level of some of these really professional apps, right? They're built by teams of programmers that are multiple people. If that's what you're planning to do, kudos to you. It's not necessary. And you only have 12 hours, so I don't know if that's going to work. But it needs to be large enough to support the group of that size. So I would recommend 2 people. Can you work by yourself? Absolutely. Can you work by yourself and still have another CSP student read your program and give you feedback or help you with debugging? Sure, that's another way you can collaborate. So I would stick to 2 people, maybe 3. I think that's a good sweet spot for collaboration for the size programs that people are creating. Or they're working by themselves and they're using peers for peer feedback, giving suggestions on the program or debugging. That's fine. It has to be another computer science principal student. It cannot be your teacher.
Great, Crystal. And then what about when you're using another program as inspiration? So for example, you love the game Candy Crush and you want to build a game like Candy Crush, but it's still your own code. You're not using their code, obviously. How does that work? Is that considered plagiarism?
We have that happen quite often. We just recently had one that was a Connect 4 game that students programmed, and they programmed it from scratch, and it was their own code. They didn't go and look up a tutorial, right? If you look up a tutorial and you follow a tutorial, the code is not yours. The code is the code of whoever wrote the tutorial. So this student just used Connect 4 as their inspiration. They wrote their own code. They didn't look it up as a tutorial. That was totally fine. We had a lot of students this last year do Wordle because Wordle was super popular. So as long as you're doing that without input from other places, like a video or grabbing code from online, totally fine for you to use Candy Crush as your inspiration. Oh gosh, I hope we don't have a ton of Candy Crush this year. I don't know what purpose Candy Crush plays. I'm sure you all would tell me.
Fun, Crystal.
Fun. Don't give away answers, Maureen. All right.
So there are questions around either rephrasing the prompt or using language from the rubric to answer the written responses. Is that considered plagiarism?
Yeah, I think that's a really practice technique that they teach you in language arts, right? So to kind of restate the question, that's fine. We have ways of saying, oh, they're just restating the question and then here comes their answer. Like I said, there's manual and automated processes. So we review all of them to make sure that it's not like, oh, well, they just restated the question and now they're answering it. So that's okay. I know that that's a really good technique that you're taught probably from the very first time you had to answer anything in elementary school all the way through high school. That's a strategy that's being taught to you all. So we will check for that and you will not get flagged for plagiarism just by repeating the question.
Crystal, we already covered this, but there are still a ton of questions about it. So I think it's worth repeating. Can you please again clarify that students can, who are programming together, they can submit the same exact code,
Yep.
but they have to submit their own written response. Can you just clarify that again? Because there's still a lot of questions around that.
Yeah, so your program can be exactly the same. Your PDF document for your program code can be exactly the same. If I'm doing pair programming with you, Maureen, our code is going to look exactly the same. What's going to look different is the written response. And what you're scored on, if you look at the rubric and the scoring guidelines, you are scored on your video and what you write in written response. So here's the other thing. If you just upload your program code and submit just that one component as final, you are going to get a 0 on create performance task. I don't care whether you wrote the end all be all app to solve the world's hunger problem. If you just submit programming code and no written response and no video, you get a 0 on create performance task. And that makes me really sad for you. Really, really sad when that happens. So make sure you're submitting all 3 components as final: the program code, the written response, and the video. Program code is submitted really as a reference for us while we're doing our scoring, but we do not base your score on that. If you look at the scoring guidelines, there's nothing on there that says, look at the program code and do they have this in the program code? It's all about video or written response.
Great. And now there's a lot of questions around how to cite. Do we have to use proper citations? Is a link okay? Is it directly in the code? Do we have to follow specific guidelines?
Yeah, so you're going to do it in the code because we said do not cite anything in written response because those all need to be your own words, and you should not be using program code in the written response that wasn't program code that you and your collaborative partner wrote together. So you're only going to cite in the program code, and all you have to do is acknowledge. We're not looking for whether you know MLA style or APA style or any specific style. All you're going to say is this right here is not written by me. It's written by and whoever has been written by. Nothing fancy, just call out those segments. If you want to throw a link in there, totally great. There is no specified style because we're not teaching citation in this course. We're teaching you computer science. So part of it is making sure you're doing documentation, but we don't care how pretty your documentation is, as long as you're saying this part's not mine, it belongs to someone else, and who that someone else is.
Crystal, back in your presentation, you mentioned not using buzzwords. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you look at that example, and maybe I can go back a few to see. No, maybe not. If you look at the example, some of the buzzwords were about, lists manage complexity because they, otherwise you'd have to use multiple variables to represent the different data. Those are kind of like these buzz things, these just phrases that are part of the definition of managing complexity using a list, versus really making those connections between what your program code is doing and how it's managing complexity in your program. So really just kind of make sure you're focusing in on how specifically this specific list manages complexity in your specific program, versus just saying things from the definition that was provided by your teacher.
Crystal, we only have about a minute left.
Okay.
There were a lot of questions, and I think this is a good place to end. There were a lot of questions. Well, what if your responses just happen to match another student's responses from across the country or in another part of the world, and they just happen to be similar, but we're not in the same school, et cetera. And I think, one of the most important things you underscored was not using public samples to start or as a place to think about writing, right? Because if you're both using public samples, you may think you're writing it independently, but actually you're both pulling from the same sources, et cetera. So Crystal, do you just want to reiterate again to sort of close us out, starting sort of like from scratch in order to, the best way is to avoid plagiarism?
Yeah. So do not use any reference materials when you sit down to write those written responses. Sit down, open up the digital portfolio, answer the questions in your own words in the digital portfolio. You're not going to match someone from across the country unless you're using some shared document where you're both pulling from the references. So if you keep all that stuff out of your head and just answer in your own words, most likely you're not going to say the same things as someone from across the country. So that's not going to happen. Your programs are probably not going to be the same, and you're not going to say the same things. So the likelihood of it happening by accident is, I don't believe that that's going to be a coincidence there. It's going to be because you're pulling from the same reference materials. So do not use sentence starters. Do not look at samples and use them as templates. And do not share your work with anyone. Make sure that you do not publish it publicly until after you get an AP score. So sometimes we get the question all the time, hey, I want to use this for my FBLA competition piece. Can I? I want to use it for DECA. Can I? Only after you get your AP score. You do not want to run the risk of it being out there in the public sphere and someone copying off of you. Keep it private. This is your test. This is 30% of your AP score. Keep it private until that time when you get your AP score, you got your 4 or 5, because I know that you're all 4 or 5 students. You got that in your hand, then enter whatever app competition you want to enter and use your program. Totally fine. But make sure that you have gotten your score and you're not caught in plagiarism. So thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully we answered a lot of your questions. This has been recorded and it will be publicly posted. We wish you the best of luck on your AP exams this year. And thanks for spending an hour with us tonight. Thanks, Maureen, for helping with the questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Clear.